Can anybody remind me of what we're talking about in the series?
Hard questions on faith.
Okay, you said that last week. What does that mean? What does that mean? Caden, what does that mean? Hard questions on his faith. What does that mean?
It means it's what we're talking about.
Yeah, so give us an example.
Question, you know what to say.
Yeah, great answer. So it's basically so that we know our Bible and that we know how to articulate that Jesus is the only way, and that we know that we have a real true faith and that we're not just following Jesus blindly. So I just want to reiterate, last week I told you guys there's some resources I'd love to buy for you. Perfect. So if you're interested in either of those resources, Mere Christianity or what's the title of it? 10 questions every teen should ask and answer about Christianity. If you're interested in just diving into this topic a little bit more outside of youth group, please talk to me afterward. I'd love to give you one of those books. But if you tell me verbally, I'm going to forget. So make sure I write it down or you shoot me a text or anything like that. So that is available for you guys. And then, I just wanted to remind you all that I know the last couple weeks have been a little challenging, been a little academic, hard to dive into, but hopefully it's been helpful, especially because Peter writes in 1 Peter 3:15, a verse that we've talked about before, that we should always in our hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And so, thankfully, at this point tonight, we've already got through some of those foundational parts of this topic, so we don't have to think as hard. It's not going to be that deep as it has been, but we're still going to be challenged to consider what we believe to be true about God and about His Word. But hopefully, this message overall will just be an easier message to consume. Boys. Okay. So before I hop into tonight's text, I want to tell you guys a little bit about a Google search that I did recently. So I don't know about you guys, but I know we all have hobbies and things that we like to do. And I would always say that for me, it's I just want to be the best person I could be. And so I Googled, what makes somebody a good person? Because, I have my ways of go about doing it. And especially, Kenny, what are you doing? Okay, well, can Kenny sit down and listen to the message and we can find the phone after?
That's my bad.
Okay, so Kenny, you can... Perfect. Okay, yes. So I know for some of you guys, like Caden, you like weightlifting, or some of you guys play football. But for me, growing up, I was very athletically disadvantaged because I always got hurt. And so I just figured if I was a nice person, then people would like me. And so basically my strategy was I'm just going to fix everybody's problems and they're going to love me. Unfortunately, that is people-pleasing, and I actually didn't please anybody, and I was always worn out and tired, so I didn't think that my approach to being a good person was really the right way to go about it, because I would end up still failing people. And so, like you guys might think sometimes, I figured, hey, Google might have the answer. So I Googled, how can I be a good person, or what makes somebody a good person? And in conclusion, this is what Google had to say. These were the answers that Google gave. You have to be kind, compassionate, you have to be altruistic, empathetic, listening, non-judgmental, you have to have integrity, honesty, loyalty, self-sacrifice, accountability, and self-control. And so after there's no questions about that. It's okay. You don't need to know every single, but it's okay. You know some of them. It will really be fine. So after conducting this Google search, I thought that maybe it would be impossible to be a good person, which leads us right into our message tonight. Why do bad things happen to good people? Maybe this is a question that you've been asked before. Maybe it's a question that you've thought yourself. And unfortunately, we do not have enough time to dive all the way into the topic, so I'm just going to be covering the latter part of that question and the assumption of good people. Next week, we're going to talk about why do bad things happen, but tonight we're going to talk about why do bad things supposedly happen to good people. And so, Reed, you really can hold your questions to the end. I believe in you. You're going to be fine. So jumping into the text tonight, we're going to be in Romans chapter 3. So if you have a Bible, feel free to turn there. Okay, Kenny, I'm proud of you.
Wait.
No, we're actually not starting there, but good answer. We'll end there, but we won't start there. So here's a little bit of context for you about Romans and then this chapter specifically. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, Romans is a book that Paul writes to the early church. So this book takes place shortly after Jesus lives, dies, and is ascended into heaven. And basically what Paul is trying to do is explain the plan of salvation to the church. Because before Jesus came and lived, as we've talked about some other weeks, they'd have to go to like the temple to like praise the Lord, to offer sacrifices. Actually, the Jewish people, if you guys don't know this, in the Old Testament were kind of the only people that could really enter into heaven. Now, the Lord made exceptions in his grace towards people, but really his plan in the Old Testament was to work through the Jewish people, because ultimately the stories that we read in the Old Testament were going to point to Jesus, but until Jesus comes, salvation just looks a little bit differently. And so in the beginning of this book, Paul talks a lot about God's punishment for those who have turned away from him. He talks about, basically that the wages of our sin is death, that we've been separated from him, and basically just unpacks what it means to be a sinner, and what that penalty looks like, but then also God's free gift to those who believe in him. And then ultimately he ends the book by talking about how Jesus bridged the gap between sinners and the Lord, essentially how we can go from sinners to saints in heaven. And so in the first 2 chapters of Romans, if you read it, which I highly recommend you read after the message tonight, you will see that Paul talks a lot about God's punishment. He explains to believers that because God is perfect, he cannot be in the presence of imperfect people. So I hate to use this as an example because it's the dreaded C word, but COVID-19, think about COVID-19. When you were in school, when you were with your families, and let's say you contracted the virus. If you had the virus, essentially you were like infected, and you couldn't be around your loved ones because you didn't want them to get infected like you. Sin kind of works the same way with God, but God being in our presence as sinners wouldn't do him any harm. Like, he's not going to get contagious. He's not going to start sinning because we sin. But rather, it's the impact that his holiness would have on us. Because God is perfect and he can't be in the presence of sinners, like, we would have to be purified. And if we're not purified, it would literally consume us. Like, we wouldn't die if we were in God's presence as sinners. And so just to give you a really brief example of how painful this might be, I was thinking about Isaiah 6:6-7, when the prophet Isaiah goes before the Lord to talk to him. And this is what it says. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." Just a little bit of context here. Basically, Isaiah was going before the Lord, and the Lord was calling him out as a prophet, and Isaiah was going to go out and spread the message that the Lord has given him. But in order to receive this message, he had to actually stand before the Lord. And in order to do that, he must be purified. Like, his sin must have needed to be cleansed in some way so he could stand before the Lord. And so literally a live coal, like, think if you have like a fire burning and there's coals in it, like literally a coal was taken out and touched to his lip. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever stubbed your toe, but this is at least 10 times more painful than stubbing your toe. Like, this is going to hurt. But if you think about it, if Isaiah would have, like, stood before the Lord for even a longer amount of time than that, it would have killed him. Because the Lord is so perfect and so separated from us that, like, his holiness would consume us. And so the Lord spared Isaiah because he had a plan for him to go be a prophet. But that's the picture that we're painting, that, like, the Lord cannot dwell with us as sinners. So some kind of sacrifice must be made. And so all of this to say, back to the point, Paul has to explain that we are deserving of death because of our sin nature, because we cannot stand before the Lord. And he makes it very clear that we have all fallen short of the standard. One very simple example for you guys is the 10 Commandments. It tells us not to lie, not to steal, not to murder, not to take the Lord's name in vain, to keep the Sabbath day and honor it as holy. And I'm sure if we were all to take a couple of minutes and walk through the 10 Commandments, we could all say that we have violated at least one. And so that proves that we are all worthy of the punishment that has been talked about all throughout Scripture. Essentially, we've all been born into sin, and thus we've been separated from God, and something must happen to restore that relationship. But at this point in Romans, Paul does not offer us a way. Google does not offer us a way. There is nothing at this point yet that can make us a good person. No matter how hard we might work for it, no matter how hard we might try, no matter if we have the 12 character traits, or even the 11 character traits that we understand, even that still is not good enough according to what Paul is writing. And so in the section of Romans 3, starting at verse 9 specifically that we're going to be looking at, Paul says this: "What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. For we have already made the charge the Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin." So as I talked about very briefly, the Jews were the chosen people of the Old Testament. And still at this time, people just generally thought that the Jews had an advantage, that they had an easier way to get to heaven because they were God's chosen people. But what Paul is saying, because he's explaining the new plan of salvation, he's saying that's how it used to be, but Jesus came. And it's not like that anymore. So just because this is how things used to be, Jesus actually came to do a new thing. And since Jesus has lived, died, and been ascended into heaven, it's no longer about being born into a specific people group or family, but really we all have access to Jesus. It's not about being born into a specific family, but rather it's about being born again. That we now have all the same access to the same Lord, the same Spirit, and even for us today, and this isn't even just Jews and Gentiles, but even for us today, that there's not one person in this room that has a greater access to the Holy Spirit, has a better access to the Lord. Maybe there's some people in here that understand the Bible a little bit better. Maybe there's some people in here that are like, hey, I sin a little bit more, so maybe the Lord keeps me a little bit further away. No, that's not true. The Lord loves us, sees us, and cares for us all equally. And also, our sin is also all equal. So even if you sin a little bit more than other people in this room, that doesn't matter because the penalty is still the same and a sacrifice still must be made. So I'd say that's Paul's first point, and that's important to know as we dive in. But also, Paul reminds us that all people are under sin. Even the Jews who the Lord had chosen were sinners. And this is just a reminder from last week, if you weren't here. We talked about that from Adam and Eve, when they sinned, everybody after was born into sin. And so ultimately, nobody can earn their way to God. Nobody can say that they're good, even if you're like Moses. Like, even Moses couldn't say that he's good. And like, I don't know about you guys, but I would think Moses has got to be good. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, chosen by the Lord. Like, he should have been killed. If you know Moses' story, like, he should have been killed as a Hebrew baby. But the Lord spared him because he had a plan for him. And I would say that even though Moses, has this like huge history in the Bible, that you are not any less chosen than Moses if you choose to receive the gift that the Lord has given. And so as we continue on in the passage and we unpack what it means to be good, Paul writes about this. So this is a little bit of a bigger chunk, so stay with me, but this is what Paul has to say. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That's kind of intense. Paul is really saying that, like, we are really screwed up. And so I don't think the question we should be asking is, why do bad things happen to good people? But why do good things happen to bad people? Why are people miraculously healed? Why does money miraculously show up when it shouldn't? Why do we even have the breath in our lungs? Like, if Paul has basically said that we were doomed from the beginning, like, what are we deserving of? And we are deserving because there's one exception to what Paul writes here. And that is Jesus. Good answer. Yes. Because we are all bad. We are all sinners. We've all chosen our own way. But there is one who was in heaven, who had never sinned, who had come down to this earth, who lived 30 odd years, never lied, never cheated anybody, never disobeyed his parents. That's kind of crazy. Never uttered an unkind word. Always did what he was asked. He never did anything wrong. Yet the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody happened to him. He was criticized, he was mocked, whipped, beaten, stripped of his clothes, and nailed to a cross where he died a long, painful death. Even though our cross over there looks really cute, looks really aesthetic, the actual crucifixion is nothing like that. And if you want to learn a little bit of what happened to Jesus, this is what he actually says about himself in the Gospel of John. I am the good shepherd. Tells us very plainly. He's good. He can do what we cannot do because he is good. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. So really quickly, we're going to pause right here. Basically, he's getting to that same point of, he's talking to the Jews right now, but there's other sheep that will be brought in. They don't listen to him yet, but they will, and they're going to be one family. Kind of the same point that Paul is iterating. And then Jesus goes on and says, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life. only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up. This command I received from my Father. And Jesus gave everything for us. And now, while it says that he was killed, you can read that he was killed, he also points out that the murder did not happen to him. Jesus was still all-powerful, even in human form. He was still fully God. And the Gospels tell us that he could have called down an army of angels. He could have taken himself away from the beating, away from the mocking. He could have called down the angels when he was on the cross. And even before he had his final breath, he could have rewritten the story and come down. But he didn't. He says that he willfully gives his life up for his sheep. Why? Well, Paul tells us this in Romans 3. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight, but the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. And so basically what Paul is telling us here is that before Jesus, we are all accountable to the law. And the only way for us to get out of the law is that if someone were to undo the law for us. For example, if you were to get pulled over and get a speeding ticket, there's really no way to get out of that unless the police officer is just like, you did wrong, but I won't give you a speeding ticket. But even more than that, he isn't just the police officer that says, hey, I won't give you the speeding ticket. He goes, actually, I'm going to give you the amount of money you would have paid for this speeding ticket, because I'm not just going to show you mercy and not give you the penalty for your transgression, but I'm going to give you even more than what you asked for. And so even though you committed wrong, not only am I going to take away the guilt, take away the punishment, but I'm going to give you a blessing in return. And so this is what Paul's communicating here. It's like, yeah, no one is good, no one is righteous, but Jesus is. And he is the one that is supposed to hold us accountable to the law. He is the one that can cast out that punishment. But because he loved us, he stepped into our brokenness so that he could take away that punishment for us. And so, even from the beginning of time, even before God created the garden, he knew that he would create the garden. He knew that he'd create Adam and Eve, and that they would sin, and that we would all fall away from him. But he has never forgotten about us. God never forgets about us. Even when we choose our own way, and we decide to prioritize school, our friends, other life choices, trying to find our identity, even when we choose our own way and disregard everything that he has told us, he never forgets about us, and he never gives up on us. And so Paul ends Romans 3 like this. He acknowledges that we can never earn our way back to God, and that we will never be good on our own. As Kenny pointed out earlier, Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. And we cannot undo the sins that we have committed. There's nothing that we could do, there's no amount of work that we could put in to earn us our way into heaven, because we just will never be good on our own. Yet, we can look upon Jesus and acknowledge that he's already paid the debt and be considered good in God's eyes. So imagine it like this. Some of you work jobs, some of you are thinking about working jobs. One day, some of you will work jobs. Imagine it like this. You're working a minimum wage job, and for some reason, in this imaginary world, you owe a $1 billion debt. If you were working a minimum wage job, trying to pay off a $1 billion debt, you could spend your whole life working and never touch a fraction of what you owe. Especially with like inflation and interest rates, I don't understand the math, but you could literally work probably 1,000 lifetimes and still never pay off the debt. But imagine this also. Let's say you come out of your minimum wage job the one day, and there's this random stranger that's walking alongside you on a sidewalk, and he has a lottery ticket for $5 billion. And he looks at you and says, "This is my gift. All you have to do is receive it." That's essentially what Jesus does for us. Not only does he freely give us what we need to pay off our debt, but he gives us abundantly more than we could ever ask for. I don't know about you guys, but I could never imagine paying off a $1 billion debt, let alone having $5 billion to my name. But if you think about it, that's kind of how God's love works. He gave us a little bit, and we misused it. We got ourselves into this debt. But Jesus came to write off this debt that we could never undo. And so, can a person truly be good? Well, according to Google, if you can put on 12 character traits, you can. But I don't know anybody who can be kind all the time, so I don't think that's going to work. I think if you try my way, that also will not work, because I've tried my way. It doesn't work. But if you can acknowledge that we will never be good, that you will never be good, but Jesus was good and paid the way for you. Then when you die and go to heaven, the Lord will look upon you and say, well done, good and faithful servant. It's not about what you've done, but it's about what my son did for you on the cross and what you were faithful with after you accepted that message that he's given you. And so you guys should come back next week. We're going to talk a little bit more about why bad things happen. But for right now, I want you guys to take just a couple of minutes, spread around the room, and just thank the Lord that you don't have to pay that debt. Like, even just think in your head, right? Because obviously we can't put a number on sin, but if you were to try, think about it like a $1 billion debt. Like, all of our income put together probably would not equal $1 billion. So the fact that we had such a big debt to pay, and Jesus so freely paid it for us, and then gave us even more. So just spread out a little bit, spend a couple minutes just thanking the Lord, praising the Lord for that. And then once you do that for a couple minutes, once you guys feel like you're done or you guys are being too silly to be quiet, you guys can gather up and do some small group questions.